afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. We have earlier spoken about the overall background, the timeline, the specifics with reference to the French Revolution in terms of immediate causes, and also of recently we have started speaking of the course of the French Revolution. In the earlier two modules, we spoke of the stage 1 and stage 2 of the French Revolution that began in 1789. Just for the convenience of the viewers, I am just recapitulating for the next 2-3 minutes some of the important points that we discussed as part of the stage 1 and stage 2 as course of the French Revolution, just to allow you to have a sense of continuity and make sense of this stand-alone half an hour discussion on the French Revolution stage 3. In stage 1, that is the time from 1789 to around 1792, the French Revolution began at the behest of the first two orders, the traditional orders of the French society, that is clergy and the nobility, to overcome the financial crisis that France had landed itself into, and in the process it searched for various options, of which one was to explore whether the first two orders could be taxed as well. Traditionally, they were immune from taxation. As we have discussed earlier, that this was this century, 18th century, was the century of reason, rationality. You had Enlightenment writers talking about it. The ideas had floated already. Printing press was being made use of, pamphleting was done. All those things had already transformed the public sphere and the intellectual climate, and it looked very odd to the Frenchmen themselves to further tax the third order. And as a consequence of this, the third estate took to itself to make sure that they legislate and deliberate on behalf of entire Frenchmen, in national capacity as a citizen and not as a member of a specific state, that is clergy, nobility, or the third estate. And that's how the National Assembly was formed and representative institutions were conceived of. You have the document of the Bill of Rights, and then subsequently a constitution was written by the Constituent Assembly, which was the specific work of the National Assembly, and that's why, since it was framing the constitution, so it was in that capacity as Constituent Assembly. Now, this stage, the first stage, was marked by some kind of moderation, because it was the bourgeoisie, it was the well-off amongst the third estate who were taking initiatives, and the ideas basically were in sync with capitalism and bourgeois economy. This had revealed to the people at the lowest rung of the third estate that these changes, however sounding and enchanting the slogans might have been, were not benefiting them, and therefore they rose almost very restive. And it's the people on the streets, it's the sans-culottes, it's the radical aspect of the revolution that gets revealed in the second stage. And it is around this time that France became a republic. It is around this time that the King Louis XVI was guillotined, and France went at war with the neighboring states who were seeing France as some kind of a threat to the monarchical order That was the order of the day for Europe. And as a consequence of this, those in power in France clamped very stringent measures which were rather dictatorial, which were rather authoritarian, and certainly not liberal or anything to do with equality and fraternity, the slogans with which the French Revolution had begun. So that marks some kind of a reversal in the second stage, but the justification was there. The justification was that France was at war with the neighboring states, and in order to defend the republic, in order to defend the gains that the revolution had made, they had to have those stringent measures. But this particular lecture is about the stage 3. This is post, you can say 1794, post the middle of 1794. In these 2.5 years or so in the second stage, to begin with, of course, when France went at war with the neighboring states, the French army received reverses to begin with, so much so that the viability and loyalty and you can say the enthusiasm of the French army was also questioned, because for centuries they had been fighting for the king, and that sense of connect with a newly formed nation and nation state was something that people were not very sure of in terms of the enthusiasm of the army to fight for the country. It is around this time that the national anthem of France, Marseillaise, that was also created, and it is redolent of wartime warmongering and wartime excitement and enthusiasm. But as the French army started winning wars during the second stage, the justification to continue with the stringent measures somewhat loosened. Moreover, the people on the street, the lower order, the petty shopkeepers, booksellers, and so forth, who had been demanding some kind of a lowering of prices, or at least controlling the prices of at least the essential commodities, mainly bread, which was their staple diet, so to say. And despite all these stringent measures in the second stage, prices of essential commodities continued to spiral. And therefore, this was yet another reason as to why those stringent measures, which were somewhat antithetical to the spirit with which the revolution had begun, failed to convince people. It could no more be cited. The circumstances outside French control could not be cited as the reason to continue with the stringent measures. So, by the middle of 1794, what we find is that there is some kind of a reaction in France against these excessive ways in which things were being carried out during the reign of terror, which characterized the second stage of the revolution. This we know as the Thermidorian reaction. Now, Thermidorian, as you would know, by now we have explained it several times at several timelines in French history, that France had done away with the nomenclature, the traditional nomenclature of the months of a year, which had obviously the Christian connect, and it had now used the nomenclature of months that had to do with nature and season cycle and farmer's time and so forth. And so Thermidorian reaction is nothing but Thermidorian stands for a month, right? Probably synchronizing with July, as we know. So from around this time, we have some kind of a reaction against the way things were happening in the second stage of the revolution. More so ever, as we have discussed earlier, while we were talking about the second stage of the French Revolution, we had seen that in the name of the law of suspects, almost the entire battery of French revolutionary leadership had been eliminated. You name the iconic leaders of French Revolution, be it Danton, Robespierre, and so forth, they had all been killed, suspected of probably not being radical enough, suspected of not being patriot enough, suspected of not being showing that much of readiness to go along the tide of excessive measures and saving the republic and so forth. Anyone who advocated any bit of liberty or lenience, which of course was very much required given the spirit with which the revolution had begun, but during the second stage the fervor was such that they were all suspected, and they were all trapped and executed by the same laws and mechanism and the instrument that they had themselves devised to rid France of the reactionaries or those who were sympathizing with monarchy or the old order or the aristocratic dominance. So this was yet another reason as to why the National Assembly at this point of time was left only with the moderates. And as I said, that the National Assembly, when undertaking the task of creating a new constitution for France, obviously was National Convention, was known as National Convention. So the convention was only left with moderate leaders, and all the radicals, radical leaders had been either killed, guillotined, or executed, or whatever. So that was yet another reason as to why there is a change in the mood of France in the July 1794 period onwards. As I discussed before, that this committee, please understand that during the second stage, the convention had entrusted practically the power of governance of France to committees, particularly Committee of Public Safety. We have earlier spoken about it, and it was by serving on these committees that we get to know several luminaries of the French Revolution, Robespierre included, and they had fallen prey to the same mechanism that they had created, the same draconian laws that they had created. And one of the important tasks of the committee or the law of maximum, as it was called in the second stage, was to curb prices of the essential commodities. And law of maximum is nothing but it was like setting the MRP, maximum retail price, and the losses that the retailers suffered were made good by subsidy from the government. So that was the arrangement. But despite all these, the prices of essential commodities continued to spiral up, and they could not be curbed. So the entire effort mechanism stood somewhat discredited by the end of the second stage. The leadership having been eliminated, French committees that were to look into price issues and curb prices, they had failed there as well. And lastly and most importantly, and we alluded to this towards the beginning of this lecture, that the second stage, the justification for the excessive measures and I would say authoritarian measures suspending liberty, equality and fraternity with which French Revolution had begun, was that France was the republic, the newly created republic was at war with the neighboring states. And it's very logical and normal to suspend these rights when the country itself, when the nation itself is at war. And initially, as I said, that French army had been receiving reverses also. So there was all the more reason or justification to clamp down these authoritarian wartime measures. But once French army had started winning wars and very continuously doing so, it had made inroads into Italy, resulting in Austria withdrawing from war position. It had even intruded into the Low Countries, that is the Netherlands, and obviously it had been able to defend the territory that was with France traditionally pretty well. It had even made inroads into Egypt and the Near East colonies of Britain, and the idea was to take on Britain, although this flash off or this flashpoint with Britain was somewhat inconclusive. It did not result in win for France or even loss for France. The point that I am making is that these military victories, once it started coming thick and fast all across, say, 1793-94, then to go on with these measures in the name of France being at war and go on expecting sacrifices from people in the name of war, again did not pass the scrutiny of logic or reason. So, obviously, the conservatives who so far were in hiding as a consequence of the assertion during the Reign of Terror by the Jacobins, and obviously on the streets, the sans-culottes. Now these conservatives are back in reckoning, political reckoning, and the radical leadership having been eliminated, it was a rather free run for them. So third stage is about this. So as you can see on your slide, the law of maximum was undone because it had failed to curb prices. Law against suspects, that was removed. Why? Because in the name of being suspicious, what it had yielded is elimination of the entire battery of leadership of the French Revolution, Robespierre included. Right? Now that the conservatives are back at the helm, the political prisoners lodged in different jails, they were freed, and these political prisoners obviously during the second stage were mostly conservatives or reactionaries, or who had betrayed little bit of sympathy for the older order or monarchy. Now was the time when the Jacobins are driven into hiding. So the scene has changed so much that now it's the turn of the Jacobins to go into hiding. Committee of Public Safety, which was the most important executive wing during the second phase of the revolution, that was rendered powerless, almost toothless. So that's the scenario in which the third stage of the French Revolution was unfolding. It all reveals an overall conservative trend, obviously bolstered by the return of the priests, royalists, emigres from abroad. Now, these are the sections of people, priests, royalists, emigres, who constituted the social profile of the conservative reaction. The conservatives, they are the ones who were not happy with the rapidity and intensity of change that the revolutionaries were bringing about. So much so that some of them had to flee to the nearby countries, particularly Austria, where the same ruling household was in power. So now that the situation had improved for them, now that the Jacobins did not look as ferocious and powerful, these people are coming back. And in 1795, the National Convention adopts a new constitution for France, which gave an official kind of approval to the dominance of the prosperous class. So now this conservative trend is stamped officially by the new constitution that comes into being, which obviously was in favor of the propertied class, the well-off class. As per this constitution, obviously the suffrage rights were given to all adult male citizens who could read and write, but there is a caveat here. Ordinary voters will elect, as per this provision, some electors, and it is these electors who would then vote to elect members of the legislative body. And to be an elector, there was a property qualification, and the property qualification was that they should at least be the proprietor of a firm or some body whose annual income is at least equal to or more than 100 days labor value. So there is some kind of a property qualification over here, and that tells you that it was not a true kind of democracy at work. Rather, it was a very limited, well-off people who wanted this kind of arrangement. The executive power was vested in a board of 5 men that came to be known as the Directory, and this body of 5 men were to be chosen by the legislative body that were elected by the electors who had been elected by the voters. So that's why it is called the Directory period, or the phase of Directory, or the reign of Directory. Another novel feature of this constitution of 1795 was that it, for the first time, included duties alongside the rights. So even in the first constitution of Republican France, you had rights, human rights, inalienable rights. Now the citizens were also to have duties, and I am quoting, you can see it on your slide, "It is upon the maintenance of property that the whole social order rests." So the bourgeois economy, the capitalist ethos is very directly, unambiguously pronounced in this constitution, right? Although the Directory is very mindful of the fact that it will not allow the situation to slip to an extent where the monarchists or monarchical order comes back to power, but it ensures that whatever liberty and freedom it has gained so far, inroads it has made vis-a-vis the traditional feudal ways, they at least are consolidated, and therefore the right to property is given a lot of emphasis. In fact, it is said that it is this maintenance of property which underpins the social order. So overall, the reign of Directory is resting on nouveau riche those who had made money very recently. They are not aristocrats. They are not from families that had a lot of money for several generations. They are the ones who probably had made quick money during the wartime profit years and so forth. Nevertheless, and they were lampooned as being ostentatious and vulgar, yet they were not willing to undo the major accomplishments of the revolution either, and that is what we just said. It warded off the leftist thread represented by Babev. Babev probably was a mythical figure who had even argued to redistribute property and do away with representative bodies because he saw them as instrument of bourgeois control and propertied class control. So that left threat was warded off. Then the rightist threat was also warded off because in 1797 elections, about which I will talk to you in the subsequent lecture in detail, they had that election had returned a lot of monarchists, or I would say constitutional monarchists. So the directory ensured that even they don't come to power, and for this they resorted to several manipulations, even taking the help of army. And Napoleon comes into being important in this scheme of things. And Napoleon was very dear to the directory period, very dear to the directory establishment. He assisted Abbé Sieyès, and in 1799, which in French history is also known as the 18th Brumaire, Bonaparte is declared as the temporary consul, and we will talk about it in the next part of this lecture, which would be about the emergence of Napoleon. Thank you.